A 15-year-old boy was brimming with ambition to complete his middle school and run away to explore the world, to be a doctor, or an engineer, or a teacher. A small family of 5, friends and relatives all around, mischievous smile never left his lips. One day, he was going to conquer the world, but he was always going to come back to this paradise of his youth. Suddenly, on a cold wintry midnight, his house was surrounded by a battalion of army, and he was forcefully evicted at gunpoint. Before eviction, 7 army personnel from the battalion raped a family guest from another village. That wasn't it. They burned his house down with everyone watching. The army did their job so well in setting fire to the house that in minutes, the blaze turned the house into ashes. And the young boy silently witnessed the destruction of his age-old family history in the blink of an eye. My world toppled down, my identity lost, my dreams crushed, and my expression of happiness disappeared. This was only the beginning. I ask you this: can you govern people into happiness? To me, happiness comes with freedom of speech, freedom of spiritual practices, freedom to live freely anywhere in the country, freedom to practice or not practice your cultural traditions, and your ability to make own choices. To my utter dismay, all these are faint concepts yet to be followed in the context of Bhutan. Families are separated for years, and many died without seeing each other after separation in 1951, 1990, and 1997 democratic movements. People inside the country, afraid of repercussions, do not talk to their relatives in exile. Bhutan does not allow exiled family members to go and see their relatives inside the country. Is your happiness a genuine happiness if it comes at the expense of others? The answer is obvious. Yes, this is exactly what Bhutan regime did. The government adopted various discriminatory policies targeting minorities one after another, and eventually in 1990, it was successful to evict 1/6 of its citizens for the sake of happiness of the palace. The incumbent Prime Minister of Bhutan, Tshering Tobgay, has repeatedly said in various international forums that enlightened fourth king, Jigme Singye Wangchuk, imposed the democracy in Bhutan. Those elites continue blowing the trumpet of democracy down as king's gift to the people despite their resistance. He never hesitated to state that there was never a request by people for democracy in Bhutan. If that is true, what do we call to those 40 political prisoners who have been imprisoned in Chemgang jail alone since 1990 for wanting democracy? What about the peaceful mass demonstrations by the ethnic minorities in 1990 in southern Bhutan and 1997 in eastern Bhutan? When Bhutan State Congress demanded human rights and democracy in 1951, the party president was packed up alive in a leather bag and thrown into Sunkos River to die. Do the political parties formed by the leaders, nominated by the king, uphold real democratic values and principles? The political parties formed by the people inside and outside the country were forbidden to participate in drafting the constitution and joining hands in democracy-making process. Sadly, the pioneers of democracy in Bhutan, who raised voice for human rights and democracy, were either kicked out of the country or did not allow them to return home on the dawn of so-called democracy. Had the country been truly democratic, its constitution would not have kept the king above the law. Mr. Prime Minister is right. The democracy in Bhutan is gifted by the king. The fourth king carefully floated the loosey-goosey idea of happiness in the country in 1974 AD and proclaimed, "I'm not so much interested in gross national product. I'm more interested in gross national happiness." But since then, they put together a curious experiment. Instead of measuring the well-being of the nation using the concept of gross national product, they thought it would be best to measure happiness. It is interesting to imagine that we could measure people's happiness and increase the amount of happiness in everyone. They even came up with the idea of measuring happiness through indicators: cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, living standard, and many others. But how can a government subjectively see this factor and objectively measure the subjective idea of happiness? How do you apply indicators such as happiness or education to what I see is a purely subjective phenomenon? In pursuit of national happiness, Bhutan is destroying the well-being of a section of its citizens, the very source of happiness. In other words, the Dragon Kingdom is making bonfire out of well-being in the race of pursuing gross national happiness. How? The birthplace of gross national happiness banned smoking and made possession of cigarettes or tobacco an offense worthy of jail sentence in 2010. In the same year, a Buddhist monk was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in jail for possession of mere $2 worth of tobacco. Is this free will? Happiness? A democracy? This idea of single expression of happiness for the entire nation, who is this for? The current obsession of Bhutan government to decide what makes people happy is bizarre. After all, happiness is a private affair. And no government should dictate the right kind of happiness, especially in democracy. In the land of happiness, the government decides the mono-definition of happiness. The definition is there only to serve government's interests. Now, surprisingly, Bhutan government defines happiness in a way that allows what people have to be considered happy. And here is the irony. On the one hand, Bhutanese government has been trying to sell the idea of gross national happiness internationally, while on the other hand, it has always restricted and violated the inalienable rights of its ethnic minorities, including Nepali speakers. Bhutan straddles two worlds, highly fabricated and hypocritical world, where her citizens are endowed with unexplainable happiness, and the real world where some of her citizens are oppressed and absolutely unhappy. Today, youth unemployment is rising at its peak in Bhutan. According to National Labor Force Survey, youth unemployment stood at 13.2% in 2016, up from 10.7% in 2015, and 9.4% in 2014. This trend is going the wrong way. Urban areas are swollen, while in the countryside, fields are left barren, and the villages are only populated by elderly. Unfortunately, employment opportunity as an indicator of happiness is not in their gross national happiness list. The royal government of Bhutan is not touched by these aforementioned problems. Rather, it is busy in artistically packaging, glamorizing, and selling the concept of gross national happiness to the outside world. I'm not sure if this paradox weighs on their consciousness. How happy do Bhutanese feel about their lives in relation to gross national happiness? The Center for Bhutan Studies and Gross National Happiness Research 2016 found out 48% of the people were narrowly happy. We don't know what is there in narrowly happy. And 9% of the people reported being unhappy, and only 8% of the people were deeply happy. Only 8%? Measuring happiness relying on 9 different domains? Interestingly, they do not propose happiness itself. They have already prescribed what would make people happy. What if the most important thing in my life is not in their list of things measured? Then how do you measure my overall well-being and happiness? What is it really measuring? In Bhutan, the rate of happiness is measured on the scale of 0 to 10. 0 being not very happy, and 10 as the happiest. Let us say a person scores 10 for being the happiest person. Can we say that this person is twice as happy as the person who scores 5? What do these numbers really mean? In the face of damning real numbers like unemployment, the cultural values and sentiments of ethnic minorities are never considered in the land of gross national happiness. There are as many as 22 different dialects being spoken in this tiny kingdom. But the truth is, rest are forgotten except Dzongkha on the evolution of creating one-track language and culture. Instead, Bhutanese rulers profess and enforce that all people in the country must renounce their heritage and instead accept Drukpa culture and traditions. Advancement of Dzongkha obviously means suppression of other languages. As an example, in 1980, the government decided to discontinue Nepali language in school curriculum, considering it to be counterproductive for the advancement of national language, Dzongkha. Counterproductive? Language, culture, and heritage of Nepali-speaking citizens were wiped out in the name of regime's one nation, one people policy. For the benefit of preserving Mahayana Buddhism, a Buddhist monk who belonged to Nyingmapa sect was shot at point blank in October 1997, simply because he participated in a rally against government's intervention on religious practices of Nyingmapa sect. 2 Christian pastors were put into jail in March 2014 in the land of Thunder Dragon. The chief priest of Nyingmapa sect was chased out of his hermitage and dragged into public until he was put into detention. Later, he was sent to jail in 1997. Bhutan imposed Drukpa culture and traditions on Mompas, Doyas, Khengpas, Brukpas, and Sarsokpas, and forced them to surrender their culture and tradition to state culture and religion. For those ethnic minorities who are still living in Bhutan, I'm left to wonder, how can they attain authentic happiness when they are forced to abandon their age-old traditions and values and cultural heritage? They have had to unwillingly succumb to the concept of gross national happiness so that they are not evicted. I'm afraid for happiness. How can it sustain in this dictated and docile environment? I have come to understand that I was kicked out of my country, where I was born, the country that I love, in order to make my king happy. I understand that Bhutan's only prescription of happiness does not come from others. My forced transition has taught me to be happy with what I have, not lament what I lost. I'm happy because I'm still alive and I have my friends and relatives and family members all around. I'm happy because I was able to find my beloved wife in the refugee camp. Her story is too close to my own. I'm happy because I have met and made everlasting friendships with my new neighbors in this great country. Yet some days, I daydream about that 15-year-old boy in that verdant village, frolicking in his youthful abandon, and I would give up everything that I have accumulated so far for a chance to go there. Many of my friends don't understand this, but for me, happiness is a private affair. No government, no indicator can ever measure how happy any of us are. This is ours to design, isn't it? At least that's what my journey has taught me. There is underbelly to Bhutan. I have always been told and taught not to believe a single story. And this usually single story is one of bad stereotypes. And the single story of Bhutan is one of happiness. I am the living proof of this duality, along with many other Bhutanese refugees, that their happiness is at the expense of us. But I'm a survivor, and I'm happy, because happiness for me and us is in me and you and you and you. Thank you.